Hell, March 19th, 1919. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. These words, penned in a letter to the New Orleans Times-Picayune, weren't from some eccentric music critic or overzealous jazz enthusiast. They came from a killer who had been terrorizing the city for nearly a year, breaking into homes in the dead of night and attacking victims with their own axes. But here's the most chilling part. On that Tuesday night, as the clock struck midnight, the sounds of jazz music filled every corner of New Orleans. An entire city danced to ward off death. Intent. It's what separates accident from murder, passion from premeditation, justice from revenge. It is not the act itself, but the intent behind it that makes it a crime. Today on Deadly Intent, we're traveling back to 1918 New Orleans, where a mysterious killer transformed an entire city's relationship with music forever. The Axeman's reign of terror lasted 18 months, claimed at least 6 lives, and culminated in one of the most extraordinary nights in American history, when jazz music became the ultimate protection against murder. But who was this killer, and what drove him to spare those who played his favorite tunes? I'm Carman Carrion, and in all my years of fascination with true crime, I've never encountered a case quite like this one. Serial killers who demand ransom, who leave puzzling clues, who taunt police. Those are familiar territory. But a killer who spares his victims based on their musical preferences, that's something else entirely. Welcome back to Deadly Intent, where we explore the cases that challenge everything we think we know about criminal behavior. Today's case takes us to New Orleans in the aftermath of World War I, when jazz was still the devil's music to many, when Italian immigrants faced widespread prejudice, and when a mysterious killer turned an entire city into unwilling participants in a macabre musical game. As someone who's always found comfort in music during dark times and late nights when I'm up working alone, and the research has gotten under my skin, when the world feels a little too dangerous, I find the idea that music could literally save lives both fascinating and deeply unsettling. What happens when your taste in tunes becomes a matter of life and death? New Orleans, 1918. The Great War had just ended, leaving the city changed like much of America. Young men returned from French trenches, carrying invisible scars, while the Spanish flu pandemic had swept through the population, leaving families devastated and communities shattered. But New Orleans remained defiantly alive. The unique cultural blend that made the city famous continued to simmer. French, Spanish, African, and Caribbean influences, creating something entirely new. And from this mixture came jazz, still in its infancy, welling from the clubs of Basin Street and the dance halls of the French Quarter. Within this vibrant tapestry, the Italian immigrant community had carved out its own distinct place. These families had fled poverty in their homeland, seeking the American dream, and many had found it through hard work and determination. Small family-owned groceries dotted street corners throughout the city, where the aroma of olive oil and fresh bread mixed with the ever-present scent of the Mississippi River. I can only imagine the courage it took these families to leave everything behind and start over in a new country. They were living the immigrant dream, working long hours, saving money, building better lives for their children. But their success came with a price. Anti-Italian prejudice ran deep in New Orleans. The city still carried scars from the infamous 1891 lynching of 11 Italian Americans, and suspicion lingered around the community. These hard-working grocers had no idea their very visibility would soon make them targets for one of the most bizarre killing sprees in American history. The New Orleans Police Department of 1918 was hardly equipped for what was coming. Detectives relied on witness testimony and whatever physical evidence they could observe with the naked eye. Fingerprinting existed but was rarely used. Communication between precincts depended on unreliable telephone lines and telegraph systems. Many officers supplemented their meager salaries by accepting bribes, creating a web of corruption that hindered serious investigations. In the Italian neighborhoods especially, residents were more likely to handle problems internally than trust the police, a legacy of decades of discrimination. It was into this atmosphere of mistrust and limited resources that the Axeman would soon emerge. May 23, 1918, the attack that would begin the Axeman's reign of terror came in the early hours of morning, when New Orleans slept under its blanket of Spanish moss and gaslight shadows. Joseph Maggio had arrived in New Orleans in 1901 from Palermo, Sicily, carrying little more than hope and an unshakable belief in the American dream. Like thousands of his countrymen, he had fled the poverty and limited opportunities of southern Italy for the promise of New Orleans, where Italian immigrants had already established thriving communities. For 17 years, Joseph and his wife Catherine had built something beautiful from nothing. Their corner grocery at Upper Line and Magnolia had become a neighborhood institution, where the scent of imported olive oil and fresh baked bread drew customers from blocks around. Catherine, born in Louisiana to Italian parents, served as the bridge between the old world her husband carried in his heart and the new world their business inhabited. The Maggios lived simply but prosperously above their store, following the practical tradition of Italian grocers who understood that success required constant vigilance. Their days began before dawn, preparing for the early customers who stopped for coffee and fresh bread on their way to work. They knew their customers by name, extended credit during hard times, and had become the kind of steady, reliable presence that neighborhoods depend on. Joseph's younger brothers, Jake and Andrew, worked alongside them, learning the business they hoped to inherit. It was Jake who arrived that horrible morning on May 24th, expecting to help open the store as he had hundreds of times before. Instead, he discovered a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His brother's skull was split open, Catherine nearly decapitated, their peaceful home transformed into a charnel house. The killer's method was methodical, almost ritualistic. He carefully removed a lower panel from their back door, chiseling it out to create a hole just large enough to reach through and unlock the door from inside. No forced entry, no broken windows, just the patient work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. As someone who checks and double-checks our locks every night, the idea of a killer who could bypass security so methodically is absolutely terrifying. This wasn't some random break-in gone wrong. This was calculated, precise, professional. The killer then retrieved the Maggios' own axe from their backyard. When Joseph's brothers arrived the next morning to open the store, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. Catherine's head was nearly severed, while Joseph's skull had been brutally split open. A bloody axe lay nearby, along with a straight razor that had been used to slash Catherine's face, then carefully cleaned and placed on the bed. But what disturbed investigators most was what the killer didn't do. Nothing was stolen, though money lay in plain sight. No drawers were ransacked, no signs of searching for valuables. This wasn't robbery. This was murder for its own sake. Less than a month later, on June 28th, the killer struck again. The attack on Louis Bessemer and his companion Harriet Lowe revealed the killer's willingness to target anyone connected to the Italian grocery trade, regardless of their personal circumstances. Bessemer, a 59-year-old immigrant from Poland, had operated his small grocery on Derzemois Street for several years, serving the working-class neighborhood with the same dedication as his Italian counterparts. His relationship with 29-year-old Harriet Lowe was unconventional for 1918 New Orleans. Unmarried couples living together faced social censure, but Bessemer and Lowe had found happiness despite society's disapproval. Harriet, originally from Jacksonville, had come to New Orleans seeking opportunity and found love instead with the gentle grocer, who treated her as an equal partner in both business and life. The night of June 27, 1918, changed everything. Both survived the initial attack, but their injuries were severe. Bessemer, struck multiple times with his own axe, suffered a fractured skull and severe lacerations. Harriet's wounds were even more grievous, deep cuts to her head and face that would challenge the limited medical resources of the era. For weeks, both fought for their lives in Charity Hospital. Bessemer slowly recovered, but Harriet's condition deteriorated. She lingered for 2 agonizing months, occasionally regaining consciousness long enough to whisper fragmented memories of that terrible night, before finally succumbing to her injuries on August 5th. Her death transformed the case from attempted murder to homicide, adding another name to the Axeman's growing list of victims. The pattern was emerging: corner groceries, pre-dawn attacks, and the unsettling preference for using victims' own tools against them. The attacks continued through the summer of 1918, each following the same meticulous pattern. The removed door panel became his calling card, a signature as distinct as any artist's. The precision suggested someone skilled with carpentry tools, perhaps even a professional. Looking at the Axeman's early victims, his intent appears to have multiple layers that make this case so unique. First, there was the practical intent. These weren't random killings. The targeting of Italian grocers was deliberate, suggesting either personal vendetta, ethnic bias, or some other connection to this specific community. The killer possessed intimate knowledge of his victims' habits and vulnerabilities. But there was also something deeper at work. The use of victims' own axes wasn't just convenience. It was psychological warfare. Imagine the terror of knowing that your own tools, the implements of your honest work, could be turned against you by an intruder. The careful removal of door panels revealed another aspect of his intent. This was someone who took pride in his craft. He could have simply smashed windows or kicked in doors, but instead he chose a method that required skill, patience, and planning. Most disturbing was what he didn't do. No robbery, no sexual assault, no obvious motive beyond the killing itself. This suggests someone whose intent was purely about power and control. Someone who derived satisfaction from the act of murder, rather than any material gain. The pattern of ethnic targeting raises questions that still haunt this case. Was this a hate crime against Italian immigrants? A personal vendetta that expanded? Or was the Italian connection simply opportunistic? These grocers were vulnerable because they lived where they worked, had cash on hand, and often worked alone. March 13, 1919, nearly a year after the first attack, editors at the Time-Picayune opened a letter that would transform the Axeman from a brutal killer into something approaching the supernatural. The letter began, "Hell, March 13, 1919. Esteemed mortal." What followed was one of the most bizarre communications ever received in a murder investigation. The writer claimed to be the Axeman himself, describing himself as a demon from the hottest hell. He boasted of his ability to move invisibly through the city, mocked police efforts to catch him, and then made an extraordinary proposition. He would kill again on March 19th, but would spare any home where a jazz band was playing. This wasn't just taunting law enforcement. This was someone attempting to control an entire city through a shared cultural experience. The letter was a masterpiece of psychological terrorism. It combined supernatural claims with very real threats, all wrapped in flowery, theatrical language. "I am very fond of jazz music," the killer wrote, "and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have mentioned." Police were skeptical, but the public's reaction was immediate and electric. As March 19th approached, the city prepared for what would become one of the most extraordinary nights in its history. Dance halls packed to capacity, homes and businesses hired bands. Those who couldn't afford musicians brought out phonographs and played jazz records at full volume. From the mansions of the Garden District to the humble shotgun houses, music filled the air. Even people who had previously condemned jazz as immoral found themselves dancing for their lives. The scene that night was unprecedented. Every musician in the city was employed. Bands played in homes, cafes, bars, and street corners. People who had never danced before found themselves caught up in the rhythm of survival. The music continued until dawn, creating a citywide concert unlike anything before or since. And remarkably, there were no murders that night. The jazz night had passed peacefully, but the Axeman's reign of terror wasn't over. Just as the city began to relax, thinking perhaps the killer had kept his bizarre bargain, he struck again. On August 10, 1919, Steve Boca represented the Axeman's most fortunate victim, if any victim of such brutality could be considered fortunate. The 42-year-old grocer had immigrated from Messina, Sicily in 1905, eventually establishing his small store on Elm Street, in a neighborhood where Italian families had created their own version of the old country. The attack followed the now familiar pattern. Boca was sleeping when the killer struck, awakening to find himself bleeding from severe head wounds inflicted by his own axe. Unlike other victims, Boca retained enough strength to cry for help, bringing neighbors rushing to his aid. His recovery was slow and painful. For months, he suffered from severe headaches and memory problems that made running his business nearly impossible. The psychological trauma proved as debilitating as his physical wounds. Boca became withdrawn, fearful, unable to sleep without checking and rechecking his locks multiple times each night. The most horrific attack came on October 27, 1919. The final confirmed victim, Mike Pepitone, embodied everything the Italian-American community had achieved in New Orleans. A successful grocer with a thriving business on the corner of Scott and Ulloa Streets in Gretna. Pepitone had built a comfortable life for his wife and 6 children through decades of hard work and careful saving. On that terrible night, Mrs. Pepitone was awakened by sounds from her husband's room. Rushing to investigate, she encountered a nightmare that would define the rest of her life. A tall, dark figure standing over her husband's bloodied body. Axe in hand, the killer fled through a back door, leaving behind another shattered family and the city's final glimpse of the mysterious Axeman. I can't imagine the trauma of witnessing something like that. Seeing a stranger in your own home, standing over your husband's body, knowing that you and your children could be next. The psychological scars from such an experience would last a lifetime. Mrs. Pepitone's survival with 6 children to support became a community rallying point. Fellow Italian Americans contributed money, groceries, and labor to help the family maintain their business. Her eldest son, just 16, stepped up to help run the store, sacrificing his own education to support his siblings. Mrs. Pepitone's glimpse of the killer was the closest anyone came to identifying him, but her description, a tall, dark figure, was too vague to be useful. The Axeman remained a shadow, visible only through his horrific acts. By the end of 1919, the terror had officially ended. though fear lingered in the city's Italian neighborhoods. Grocers had modified their homes, installed better locks, and hired guards. Some had temporarily closed their businesses or moved to different areas entirely. As the Axeman's crimes came to an end, his true intent becomes even more puzzling. The jazz letter revealed someone who understood spectacle, who knew how to manipulate public fear and fascination. This wasn't just about murder anymore. It was about control, about making an entire city dance to his tune. The letter's timing is crucial. After nearly a year of silent, methodical killing, why suddenly seek the spotlight? The theatrical nature suggests someone who had grown bored with simple murder and needed a bigger stage for his performance. Modern criminal profilers believe the Axeman likely fit this profile. A male in his late 20s to early 40s, skilled in carpentry or construction, familiar with Italian-American culture, possibly with military experience based on the tactical nature of his attacks. The jazz connection reveals something fascinating about his psychology. In 1919, jazz was still controversial music, associated with brothels, drinking, and what many considered moral corruption. By demanding jazz be played, the Axeman wasn't just asking for music. He was forcing respectable society to embrace what they had previously condemned. Was this part of his intent, to make the city not just fear him, but participate in something they viewed as sinful? It adds another layer of psychological control that goes beyond simple murder. The ethnic targeting suggests someone intimately familiar with New Orleans' Italian community. This could indicate a former employee harboring grudges, someone from within the community itself, or an outsider who had spent considerable time studying their habits and vulnerabilities. By 1920, the Axeman had simply vanished. No arrest was ever made. No suspect was ever formally charged. The case files gathered dust in police archives, joining New Orleans' long list of unsolved mysteries. The official toll: 6 deaths and 6 injured survivors. Though some researchers believe the true number might be higher, the attacks had lasted 18 months, transformed a city's relationship with jazz music, and created an enduring legend. Modern forensic analysis reveals patterns 1918 investigators couldn't have recognized. Geographic profiling suggests the killer lived or worked in central New Orleans. Toolmark analysis indicates professional-level woodworking skills. The consistent attack patterns suggest tactical awareness that might indicate military or law enforcement training. What strikes me most about this case is how it demonstrates the limitations of early 20th century investigation methods. Today, we'd have DNA evidence, sophisticated crime scene analysis, psychological profiling, and computer mapping of attack patterns. The Axeman might have been caught after his first or second attack, but there's something almost mythical about the fact that he was never caught. In a city famous for its ghosts and legends, the Axeman earned his place in folklore, not just through his crimes, but through his successful escape from justice. Recent theories have connected the Axeman to similar attacks in other American cities between 1911 and 1919. Some researchers believe he might have been a railroad worker, which would explain both his ability to move between cities and his knowledge of immigrant communities who often worked on the railroads. Looking back at the Axeman case over a century later, his ultimate intent remains as mysterious as his identity. Was he a disturbed individual acting on personal grudges? A bigot targeting Italian immigrants? A thrill killer who escalated to theatrical displays? The jazz letter suggests someone who viewed himself as more than just a murderer. He wanted to be remembered, to become a legend. In that, at least, he succeeded completely. What disturbs me most about this case is how the Axeman managed to terrorize an entire community while remaining completely invisible. He understood human psychology well enough to know that the threat of violence could be just as powerful as violence itself. The night of March 19, 1919, represents something unique in criminal history. a killer who united his potential victims in an act of defiance. Instead of hiding in fear, New Orleans chose to celebrate, to fill the night with music and joy. As someone who finds comfort in music during difficult times, I'm struck by how the Axeman inadvertently created one of the most beautiful responses to terror in American history. He meant to control the city through fear, but instead, he gave them a night of unprecedented unity and celebration. Perhaps that was his greatest failure and their greatest victory, that his attempt to spread darkness instead lit up the entire city with the sound of jazz. The houses where the Axemen struck have long since been torn down or renovated beyond recognition. The small Italian groceries that dotted New Orleans street corners in 1918 have largely disappeared, victims of changing times and the fears sown during that terrible year. But jazz endures. The music that once served as protection against a killer has spread around the world, becoming America's greatest cultural export. Every time we hear a jazz song today, we're connected to that extraordinary night when an entire city played music to save their lives. The Italian-American families who survived the Axeman's terror went on to become integral parts of New Orleans culture. Their descendants still live in the city, though few remember the fear that once gripped their grandparents. The community that was targeted for death became part of the city's living heritage. For true crime enthusiasts like myself, the Axeman case represents something unique, a mystery that may never be solved, but continues to fascinate because of its sheer audacity. This wasn't just a serial killer. This was someone who understood the power of legend, who knew that mystery could be more powerful than revelation. The case reminds us that some crimes transcend their immediate horror to become part of our cultural memory. The Axeman didn't just kill. He changed how an entire city thought about music, about safety, about community response to terror. Most importantly, he showed us that even in the face of incomprehensible evil, people can choose defiance over despair, music over silence, celebration over surrender. The question behind every case we examine here on Deadly Intent remains. Every killer has a reason. But does reason ever justify murder? The Axeman's reasons, whatever they truly were, died with him in anonymity. His victims' reasons for dying were simply that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, living honest lives that somehow attracted a killer's attention. But the city's reason for dancing that night in March 1919, that's something we can understand. When faced with terror, they chose joy. When threatened with death, they chose life. When confronted with darkness, they chose to fill the night with music. In the end, that may be the Axeman's most important legacy, not the fear he spread, but the beautiful defiance he inadvertently inspired. Thank you for listening to Deadly Intent. The Axeman of New Orleans remains one of America's most fascinating unsolved cases, a mystery that spans crime, music, culture, and the enduring human spirit. If you're interested in learning more about this case, I recommend visiting the Historic New Orleans Collection, which maintains archives of original newspaper accounts and police reports from the investigation. Jazz saved lives that night in March 1919. While we can't say music will protect us from all dangers, we can remember that art, culture, and community solidarity remain powerful forces against those who would harm us. Until next time, remember, sometimes the best response to terror isn't silence or surrender. Sometimes it's turning up the music and refusing to let fear win.